afternoon. I first want to thank Reverend Jane and Dawn for the opportunity for offering a word this afternoon. To start us off, I would like to invite us into something possibly a little strange, but it does have a point to it, I promise. It is a brief embodied practice to help us center ourselves in this space and in our bodies. So as you feel comfortable, willing, and able, I invite you to close your eyes and take a deep breath in and out. And as you breathe in the good that life has to offer, and breathe out anything that's burdening your mind today. And you may open your eyes. I want you to just shake one arm out. You can do this as gently or as wildly as you'd like. And as you shake it out, let that energy carried through this week and through this day move out of you. And now shake the other arm and shake out any heaviness or tension that you carried with you into this space. And now, if you would point your hands towards the earth and repeat after me, I am rooted in creation.
I am rooted in creation.
And reach your palms out upwards and repeat after me, I belong in this community of care.
I belong in this community of care.
Now cross your arms over, giving yourself a big hug, and repeat after me, I am embraced by God's love.
I am embraced by God's love.
Exactly as I am.
Exactly as I am.
All right, thank you so much for trusting me to do something a little silly this morning. This practice is inspired by Reverend Adrian Thorne, who is a senior minister of the Riverside Church in New York City, based on the idea that the pains and the stresses and the traumas that we endure in this life are experienced and stored in the body. Thinking through our pains will not provide full healing. Instead, we need to be able to center ourselves in our bodies, center love in our bodies, and work our pains out through our bodies for an opportunity for true healing to take place. Major sources of daily pain can arise through the ways we move through the world. The makeup of our bodies, our race, our gender, the gender of those we love, where we were born and where we have moved, are evaluated and judged by society. Society takes these characteristics as a shorthand and weaves narratives over us like clothing we can't take off, attempting to define our identity and our worth. Before we ever even are known as individual people, the stories told about our lives can go before us. They attempt to tell us who we are and what we have to offer the world. These stories may even call our humanity into question, regardless of how good or loving people we may be to those around us. This ongoing judgment of our lives and our bodies and our humanity can feel like an annoyance, or it can lead to situations that might even feel dangerous. So we may feel our bodies in a state of heightened activation and hypervigilance. Am I safe here? Am I accepted here? Can I belong here as my authentic self? A lifetime of navigating these narratives and assessments of safety can be exhausting and can wear us down to the point we start to question our own worth. We begin to wonder where we can find the truth of our identity. Society will label certain groups of people who are LGBTQ, people who are poor, who are homeless, who are immigrants, as unlikely people to hold value. It will assume we are unlikely people to be intentionally sought after by God. But the good news is this: God seeks out those on the margins of society. Those considered the most unlikely according to society standards are those who God envelops in divine love and invites into the center of God's life, experienced through strong communities of embodied care and healing. We see the story of the unlikely being drawn into God's life and mission throughout the Bible. The book of Acts is no different, as it captures the beginning of the Christian church after Jesus' resurrection and the broadening of the apostles' mission to minister to Gentiles, who were now considered just as much a part of the people of God as the Jewish people. Now, this was not an easy mission for the apostles. The Jewish people and the Gentiles had all these stories about one another ringing in their ears as they encountered one another. Gentiles, in many instances, were people who were aligned with the Roman Empire, worshiping the Roman gods, pledging their allegiance to the Roman emperor. Gentiles saw the Jewish people as set apart from the empire. Because the Jewish people were a small minority group that had different practices that caused them to stand out, their position in the empire was fragile. As is often the unfortunate reality of small minority groups, the Jewish people could easily be victims of violence committed by the empire or by Gentiles. So there was a divide between these two groups. The narratives woven about their value to society clashed, but this was not a situation that God was willing to let lie. God is not simply a God of one people, but is the creator and redeemer of the whole world, seeking to draw all people into God's love. The followers of Jesus were then called to step over these divides, to seek after one another. Those Gentiles who the apostles may have considered to be unlikely to receive membership in the people of God were exactly those that God instructed the apostles to go after. Our reading from Acts this afternoon further highlights this drawing of the unlikely into the life of God. Our passage has us follow Paul and Silas in Macedonia as they seek a place to pray, as they continue their mission to the Gentiles. They are followed by a slave girl who has a spirit of divination that made her slave owners a great deal of wealth through her fortune-telling. For days she prophesies after the apostles that they are slaves of the Most High God and know the way of salvation, until Paul gets so annoyed by her constant and loud presence that he commands the spirit of divination to leave her. After the owners realized their hope for making money was gone, they beat and imprison Paul and Silas, who spend their time in prison praying and singing among the other prisoners, until an earthquake shakes the foundation of the prisoner, freeing all of them. Now, it is easy to treat Paul as the main character, given his importance to Christianity. But my divinity school professor, Reverend Dr. Willie Jennings, urges us in his commentary to let Paul take a step back and let the Spirit of God take a step forward as the main character. Now, there are many unexpected turns in this text and many unlikely characters drawn into the story of God. First, we encounter the slave girl. She was afflicted by a spirit of divination, a spirit that took hold of her voice, the condition that resulted in her slave owners taking hold of her body and enslavement for their own financial gain. She is not named in the text, and so she is only defined by the economic value she brings in for her owners. Her prophecy about the apostles' identity and mission were true. They were claimed by God, and they knew the way of salvation. Her experience of enslavement drew her to those who knew salvation, and we see this as Paul commands the spirit to be removed from her. The spirit that kept her voice and her body in captivity, solely valued by society in terms of how she could bring in money for others, was now gone. We do not know what happened to her from this point on, but we know that in this moment of freedom from this spirit of divination, this woman encountered the true Spirit of God. Her story now intertwines in the story of God. She can shed the narratives that society wove over her and redefine her identity. Though she would have been considered an unlikely person by society standards, a slave afflicted mentally and physically by captivity, she is one impacted by God's life and movement in the world. She is the one who has experienced God's liberating actions as she finds her voice freed from captivity. God seeks the unlikely and practically alters their life and identity to claim them as one of God's own. The ending of this passage from Acts reinforces this radical inclusion. When the earthquake hits the prison, we find that it is not just Paul and Silas who are freed, but all of the prisoners. The guard sees that the prisoners are gone and is ready to end his own life out of fear of the consequences. Paul and Silas find the guard and minister to him. They save his life in more ways than one. Not only do they stop his self-harm, but they tell the guard at his own request about salvation, about Jesus, about God. The guard feels moved to tend to the wounds of the apostle and to feed them, something we will find is typical of entering into God's story. Participating in God's life calls us to care for one another in embodied ways, to tangibly participate in one another's healing, to be drawn towards those most afflicted in society. Transformation is happening here. Where the guard had just been part of the force that caused those wounds, he now sought to heal those wounds. His own story was intertwined with God's, and through that process, his own life and identity were being redefined. He chose to claim that new identity and solidify it through the act of baptism. No longer would he be known as an agent of empire, somebody we may consider to be unlikely to be drawn into the life of God. Now he would be defined as a child of God. In this one passage, then, we see both a slave of empire and a guard of empire transformed. Each seems like an unlikely person, and yet when the Spirit of God is seen moving through this passage, we see how God seeks after each of them, enveloping their lives into God's life, redefining their identity and their worth. And in fact, it is the very sight of what makes them unlikely people that makes them well suited to be participants in God's mission on earth. After all, if it was not these people, with their lives bound to captivity and freed from it, who are the ones impacted by God's mission, we may not have seen that God's mission is inherently tied to the freedom of all those held in captivity and enslavement. Society does not get a final say on who these people are and what they have to offer the world. Instead, God embraces them and loves them, showing that love through practical and embodied encounters of healing. A new vision of life beyond these things that society uses to separate and bind us grows through their stories. It is a beautiful vision of a life lived together across divides, a life accompanied by communities of embodied care and healing, a life saturated with the Spirit of God that moves through each and all of us. We are reminded of this vision when we consider our second reading from today, from John, in which Jesus describes a desire for all to be one. This is not an idea of oneness that flattens our differences and takes away our authenticity. It is rather an idea that honors authentic difference and is made stronger, richer, and more vibrant because of it. John tells us that we are drawn into the relationship between God and Jesus. Our Christian scriptures and tradition tells us that God and Jesus are one, that God became human in Jesus, and yet we often think of them as two distinct experiences of the divine. And without getting too far down a tangent of the Trinity, I will leave it to say that even within God's own being, there is diversity within the unity. Our differences and diversity are honored in God's eyes, since no one single experience can fully encapsulate who God is. Our diverse communities and conversations is how we come to see God with greater clarity. It is when we use those differences to divide one another and judge one another that we start to misstep. This vision of life together is possible for us to bring into reality. We must acknowledge that society does not get the final say of the narratives of our lives and our worth. This means that we should allow God to move through us as we cross divides, to reach out to one another. We cannot uncritically believe in the narrative society has woven about how this or that characteristic defines people and their worth. Instead, we are invited to get to know one another, to get to know how our different stories are drawn into God's story, to get to know how God has moved through our diverse lives in deeply impactful ways. This is how we will see a fuller picture of the living God and God's movement within and among us. That picture will always get richer as we live life together, even and especially in the most unlikely relationships. And finally, we cannot allow these narratives of society to define us and our own internal sense of our own identities and our own worth. The good news is that no matter how unlikely we may think ourselves to be, we are already God's child. We are already claimed by our Creator, and we are called to participate in the life of God as it unfolds in the world around us. We must shift our perspectives to see the narratives of our lives through the eyes of God. And as we begin the word this morning, we acknowledge that that perspective shift will involve our whole selves. So, when you feel society weighing you down, when you feel yourself pulled into society's definitions of who you are and what you have to offer this world, I invite you to take time to open your awareness to the God who created you with love and intention. I invite you to do whatever you feel called to do to let that love of God move through your body. Shake out that which sticks to you as you navigate this world and dance with the divine. Feel joy bubble up in your chest, the breath of God fill your lungs, the love of God overflow in your heart. Let that love be embodied, and let that embodiment lead towards healing, resting in the knowledge that you are, above all else, a beloved child of God. So once more, I invite you to reach your palms towards the earth and repeat after me. I am rooted in creation.
I am rooted in creation.
And reach your palms turned upwards. I belong in this community of care.
I belong in this community of care.
And cross your arms over, giving yourself a big hug, and repeat after me. I am embraced by God's love.
I am embraced by God's love.
Exactly as I am.
Exactly as I am.
Thank you. Amen.
Amen.